Hello, and welcome to this special joint podcast of the Success Showcase and Lighting the Candle, A World That Works. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin, and with me, as always, is my Success Showcase co-host, Chip Januszewski, as well as the host of Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, Bill Carell, and co-host of Lighting the Candle, as well as host of Pets, People, Life and Longevity, Jen Jeremias. Welcome, everybody.
Hey, buddy.
Thanks.
Good to have everyone here. And what we are doing on this special episode, just to give our listeners a little background, at the end of 2023, Success Showcase did a series of podcasts talking about mental health and dealing with depression. And this is an outgrowth of that. We're going to be talking about grief and how we deal with death, our experiences with it. And of course, to facilitate this, we've brought in an expert. We have Kate Mollison, who's going to run this. Kate is a grief and bereavement specialist. So I will toss it over to you. Kate, take it away.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, so just to give the listeners a little bit of background around myself, I am a certified grief coach. I am a clinical case manager, and I have training and certification as a trauma play therapist. After my own experience with grief and loss when I was widowed in 2020, I turned that tragedy into a business endeavor where I realized there's a huge gap in services for people experiencing grief. So thank you for having me here today, and I'm really excited to facilitate this conversation with you all. And if you guys are ready, let's get started.
Yeah, it's great that we could have you here. And of course, one of the reasons that we've gathered this group together is that over the past year or two, every one of us has lost somebody, either a parent, a friend, in-laws. We've all had dealings with grief over the past 18 months or so.
Yeah, and grief is something that we as a culture and as a society aren't taught how to effectively manage. By that, I mean, we're taught that it is something that just we get over, we finish, we check it off the to-do list, and we're supposed to get back to normal. But the science behind grief says that there is no normal after that type of experience, that your body chemistry, your chromosomes, your cells are quite literally changed. And so we have to start changing the conversations we have about grief. And so first of all, I'd like to extend my deepest condolences to all of you in your losses. I know that it's not an easy thing to experience, and I want to thank you for your openness and willingness to participate in this conversation.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely. And
so I'd like to get started by just asking you guys to tell me the first word that comes to mind when someone says grief. What are some things that you think about, just rapid fire?
Sadness.
Sadness.
Loss.
Sadness
Yeah.
was the same word I came up with.
What else do you have, Dan? Give me another one.
Okay, hold on a second.
We'll circle back. Bill, what were you going to say?
despair,
Despair.
emptiness, loneliness, sorrow. This sucks. I don't
Sucks.
even know where
Yeah.
it sucks from. It just sucks.
It does. Yeah, that's a pretty all-encompassing. Jan, did you think of something?
I have not.
Okay. Sometimes there's not a word for it, right? Like that's completely normal, and we struggle to articulate the breadth of what we're experiencing. But if we're thinking about grief and loss in that perspective in relation to ourselves and to the people that we've lost, why are we so afraid to talk about it as a culture? Why is it so difficult for us to speak out loud about it? What do you guys think?
Well, I think actually what you just said, why is it so difficult? It is a difficulty. I mean, when you're talking about it, it's very emotional, and it's tough to find the words to articulate what you're feeling. And also for a lot of us, we're sort of taught from a young age. It's like, well, this is part of life and you have to buck up and deal with it. And, that's not necessarily the best way to deal.
Sure.
I would say there's a cultural hand-me-down that's come from several generations that have dealt with a lot of loss, a lot of people who starved to death, a lot of people who froze to death in the cold, who went through genocidal circumstances and that sort of thing. And the Brits have always said it's best to keep a stiff upper lip and never let them know what you're thinking. Okay. So with that in mind, I can remember at an early age, fall down, get a little bit of notice from crying the first time from my mother. Then when my dad goes, wipe yourself up, wimp, get up and get back in the game. Let's go. So there's many different ways to get responses to the grief phenomenon, and just even describing what it is and how it feels is very difficult. There's actually not much language that comes to mind quickly in terms of identifying, as we said, what it actually is.
Two things that come to my mind, and one is Bill said something about the word thinking, about how, we're not taught, like people don't exactly know what to think about it, or they aren't willing to express it. And I think part of it is the fact that we're not a culture that really, as human beings, people don't show their emotions very easily. It's kind of like you're supposed to kind of create this wall, like you go to work and you're professional and your emotions aren't supposed to infiltrate that world at all. And it doesn't matter what you're going through. That was one thing that came to mind right away, is this feeling that, and I think especially being a woman and having worked in a very professional areas, women who were emotional were always perceived, I think, as being weak, and for a long time. And so I think that they don't want that weakness to show, especially in the professional world, because they feel like they'll be criticized or they'll be thought less than because of that. So I think that is some of it. I think also culturally, people don't like to think, even of their own death at all. Like it's something that in our culture is kind of, people don't want to go there. Like in other cultures, in Eastern philosophies or whatever, is they look at, I think someone once said to me, the day you're born is the day you begin to die. And it's very different in some of these cultures as their perception of death. And I think our perception of death is like this very negative thing and not a part of that life cycle.
Where do you think that stems from for us as a culture? And anybody can weigh in on that.
I think part of it is just the fear of the unknown. What is death? No one knows what's beyond the pale. But I've been studying Eastern philosophy for a while now, and there is a big difference between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. And in the East, death is part of the journey. And it has to do with reincarnation and the next levels in our existence, where Western philosophy tends not to do that. And I think it's partially the Judeo-Christian upbringing, but it's a very different viewpoint. And I mean, even like one of the things that I recently studied was Kabbalah, and that's part of Judaism. And most people, if you ask about Judaism, do you believe in reincarnation? Oh no, reincarnation's not part of Judaism. Actually, it is. It's part of Kabbalah, but most people don't talk about it because we're ingrained in that Western Judeo-Christian ethic.
And some people get caught up in talking about religion, and they think that talking about death is very tied to religion. And so there may be that cultural disparity for us, as Westerners, to avoid those conversations that not only make us emotionally uncomfortable, but make us politically and societally uncomfortable.
I was going to say before, there's a whole thing of politism as well. When you said politically, the first part of that is polite. So long and short of it is that people are uncomfortable talking about things that they're uncomfortable about, you know? And so if you bring up something with somebody who doesn't feel like they have a strong answer or something to contribute, I can tell you the first 6 or 7 years that I was going to Catholic school, I didn't go for all those years, but I went to catechism on Saturday morning up until my teen years. I just got a little tired of Father Miller, who I absolutely loved, answering questions with, well, it's a mystery, my son. You know, it was very unsatisfying, you know, at that age to be looking at somebody who I would say, you know, God, they're talking to God every day, you know, and how can they not have a little bit more information for me? Are they not, you know, like clued in on the code and stuff? I think they are, but what if they're not? What if nobody's got that code? Holy mackerel. Can't handle it, you know?
You know, I wonder if that's also part of why we don't talk more about it, is because we don't know. And so many of us you don't want to deal with stuff that you don't know about.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you don't want to admit that you don't know. You don't want to say it's a mystery or, yeah, I don't know. So we just avoid the topic altogether.
It's a great point. And the fact of the matter is there is a lot of information out there that just goes undiscovered or untalked about. In that same vein, what do you think happens to you after you die?
Well, see, now the jury's still out on that. And that again is part of the whole don't know. But I can tell you the one guy that I did listen to was the guy who pretty much accurately said nobody gets out alive.
Now,
But they do say there was one guy that did. So, and he didn't come back and really tell us a whole heck of a lot of stuff that was useful today for some reason.
Yeah, I kind of have a different approach to this a bit, basically because of what I've been doing for quite a while now. I'm very involved in my church facilitating what we call Lectio Divina, which is just studying the weekly gospel. And we've been doing this for several years now. And what we're talking about, I mean, all of the challenges we talked about as far as not wanting to talk about it and this and that, whatever, a lot of that is just taboo stuff that we've made up ourselves. When we talk about being, and Eric and I just did a podcast on this yesterday, because you know, I'm the happiness and success GPS, and I always talk about leading with positivity and so on and so forth. And the bottom line is, we all came from the same being, and whether we believe in God or another being and so on and so forth, going back to our roots, we are all connected. And that's where we came from. That's where we're going from. Basically, we are spiritual beings on a physical journey. That's what I truly and strongly believe. And so grounding ourselves that way, getting back to our feelings and so on and so forth. Some of them are spiritual, where we're never going to understand. I mean, every single week when we talk about Lectio Divina, basically we talk about what's a word or phrase that caught our attention, what's our personal connection, but then what are we going to do about it? And a lot of it is just working on yourself, being in the present moment and understanding what's going on, and realizing that it's beyond ourselves, number one. But number two, we're all wonderful people and we all come from there. Now, fortunately, my grief experience, I'm the oldest of 7 children. I'll be 70 years old this year. I lost my dad in 2019, my mom a year and a half ago, both at age 91. So my experiences are very, very new. And it's interesting going back as far as how you're feeling about it and so on and so forth. And my dad and mom were married for a long time. But I remember my mom feeling guilty that she wasn't feeling super, super bad, crying, grieving, and so on and so forth about having lost her husband, even though their relationship was more of one of bringing up 7 kids and everything else over all the years, and it wasn't really that great. And then, you know, when I lost my mom a year and a half ago, it's the same thing. I mean, what are you supposed to do and so on and so forth? It's not about that. It's just about being there. And it's just, it's a wonderful thing having the memories of people, accepting that we are where we are. And obviously, as you get older, you know, what I got a big one coming up this year, I'm accepting the fact, you know, I'm mortal, it's going to happen and so on and so forth, but I'm also very grounded in where I came from, where I'm going to. And that's, you know, so important to really know that. And it's obviously the memories go on. I have two grandchildren, but I also just had a grandniece. My sister had a baby. Daughter had a baby the middle of last year, and the baby was named Grace Marie. And I knew where Marie came from because it was from her great grandmother on her dad's side. But I'm saying, where did Grace come from? My mom was very, very spiritual, and she always talked to the Holy Spirit, but she always called the Holy Spirit Grace. And that's why she's got the first name Grace. I mean, if you look at ways to kind of connect things and so on and so forth, and get back to the way things really truly are as far as being goes, even though we don't understand it and we can't talk about it, and some people think it's taboo to talk about it. I mean, it's not like it doesn't upset me and so on and so forth, but I'm also in a comfortable place of understanding and acceptance.
I really want to take a moment and just pause and highlight what you just said there, Chip, because it's so important that a couple of the key success pieces to healthy grieving is that presence and that in the moment understanding of your finality, of the legacy that they leave, and of how it lives in your body, and knowing that ultimately it's the memories that you keep alive moving forward. So I absolutely love that you have that perspective and you're able to apply it. And thank you for sharing that with the listeners. I think that that's super valuable. Does anybody else have anything they want to add before we move on?
A couple of things. Go ahead, Jan.
No, Bill, go ahead. It's fine.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
Now, kids, don't argue.
I'll go next.
No, one of the things I was thinking about the uncomfortableness is I think human beings in general want to be able to fix things for people. It's very hard for them to see people in pain. And I think some people's uncomfortableness is the fact that they can't fix it. You know, it's like they look at someone who's grieving and they feel their pain, and it's not like they can make it any better. And so I think as someone who, it takes a lot of like almost, I don't know, self-control in the fact of being with someone or just holding space for that person and just saying, I'm just here. But that's really hard for people. And
Getting
they don't know
comfortable with the uncomfortable.
and the uncomfortable, and they don't know what to do with that. So they'd rather just like not talk about it or not deal with it than have to go into that space. So that's Thank
you. Bill?
Thank you. So I love what Chip said about his mom. And I guess, if I look back over all of my experiences of loss and kind of look at the myriad feelings at different times with different people being gone, I could actually see that there'd be a time where your inner self is in a processing state all the time and has gotten good at accepting rather than fighting it. And I think where I've felt the most grief and the strongest reactions was not when somebody went because I knew it was their time. It was because I was resisting the notion that they were gone. They would not be liking my Facebook posts. I would never hear back from them on something that we shared a memory on that no one else on the planet shared with me, that was going to go out of existence unless I found a way to keep it alive and memorialized it in telling the stories myself with other people. So I definitely could understand. I never had a notion that I was doing it wrong, in terms of the grieving process. But I can tell you that there was an array, like, I don't know, the old 64 color Crayola box with all these different things that occurred differently in different circumstances. And for example, when I found out in the third grade that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, they loaded us onto buses at around 2:00 in the afternoon, maybe a little bit afternoon, if I remember correctly. We all went home. I found my mom curled up on the floor in a ball, sobbing uncontrollably. And in the third grade, I guess I was 8 years old, 9 years old, maybe. I didn't understand it. And she had to explain to me why she was so upset. And I still didn't understand it. And I had to resolve myself to just be with that. And then about 4 years later, my grandfather, my remaining grandfather, passed away. And when I went to his funeral, I was more upset by watching the loved ones that I had, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, my mom, my dad, seeing how upset they were. It really, really bothered me because I didn't have that much of a connection and a relationship with my grandfather. And then about a year later, I lost a very close friend in my neighborhood who went through an exhaustive cancer treatment, up to and including losing his hair as a child. And the whole neighborhood got together around that. And we felt communally terrible and never had the language to get it out into a place where we could talk about it. We just walked around feeling terrible. And so since then, I'm a little older than I was. And like Chip, my birthday's March 21st. Chip, I don't know when yours is, but that's when my 70th resolution, is complete. And quite frankly, I went through a really bad time last year and the year before. We were losing on average one person every 3 to 4 weeks in the family. Close family friend, aunt, uncle, cousin, nephew, so on it went. Good networking buddies. And I got to the point this time last year where I had really let myself go, and I put on about 30 pounds that I lost at the beginning of COVID. I finally had to have a moment where I decided this isn't going to keep me around for very much longer if I keep behaving this way. And I am running on a little bit, but I just want to get to the point where I tell you that, like Chip's mother, I got to a point and I finally felt I did not have to understand what my body was going through in order to make a decision to take care of myself.
I love that. And I think it's so important that you make that point that grief affects us more than just emotionally, right? Like it has an effect on our physical bodies as well, the way we carry it, the way we process it, the way we understand it or lack to understand it. So again, my deepest condolences to you. That is so hard to experience. But it really touches on the next point that I want to talk to you guys about. And that's reflecting on and looking at what type of griever are you? Where it sounds, Bill, very much like you're an introspective person and you sit with things and you let them marinate and you're able to apply them out in the world. And Chip, you sound, similar in that way, where you're able to just be present and process it and then apply. But not everyone has that capacity where, some people get angry or some people resort to maladaptive behaviors or avoid altogether. When you think about your own experiences over the last couple of years with grief and your losses, what type of griever would you self-identify as?
Well, again, watching my mom feel guilt over my dad. I mean, she talked to the counselor about that right after my dad passed away. And the counselor said, "You're perfectly normal. It's perfectly normal to go through that." And the bottom line is everybody handles things in different ways. And it's not like I keep it in for the sake of keeping it in. I have lots of wonderful memories. As Eric knows, I'm a very visual person, and sitting in front of me, this has been my home office since 1996, are calendars with pictures of my family and friends and so on and so forth for the last 6 years. I finally got smart a few years ago and said, I got all these things, I'm going to put them up everywhere as opposed to just once. And, my mom's there, people who are gone are there, people who are here are there, my grandchildren and so on and so forth. And the bottom line is I still feel presence with them, with myself, and that's the most important thing. Physically, they're gone. I talk about that as being transition. Often when people leave us, I just say they have transitioned from their body to wherever they're going, which is basically they're still here. And that, and people see signs of that all the time. And
there's actually science behind it that supports the atoms are dispersed in a metaphysical kind of way. So their atoms still exist on this plane, even if their physical form in the way you knew it doesn't. Yep. So I find it interesting that spirituality connection is so prevalent. And I appreciate that perspective.
Yeah. And if you go through meditation and so on and so forth, I mean, people who are visual and so on, I mean, they'll just take a look outside or this or that or whatever. And something there is just going to remind them of somebody. It could be, you know, a butterfly reminding you of your mom or this or that or whatever. And it's just the way you look at things. And there is no right or wrong. Again, our human minds, we were born, you know, me being a grandpa, kids don't say anything when they're born. All they're doing is observing. And we can go back to that any point in time. And whatever we observe, there's no right or wrong. It's just us and it's where we are and so on and so forth. And so visualization and being able to take that time out and meditate on that. And if you can do that, it's just a wonderful thing. I mean, I enjoy walking a whole lot. When COVID hit, that's what I started doing. I used to walk periodically, but now I walk every single day. And obviously I'm in really great shape because of that. And it's great just walking around. And sometimes I'll just be singing a mantra in my head while I'm doing it, just to keep myself busy. So to each their own. I mean, there's different things that you can do. Obviously, there's a lot of things that I'm sure that you teach as far as what people can do. These are for instances. A lot of times people have to see a list of things that they can do and say, oh yeah, I can do this, 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 and this. But it's just so important to get back to the fact that that person in the mirror is okay and going to be okay no matter what. And that person that they've lost somehow is still with them, looking out for them. That's the way that I look at it.
I love it. Eric, I'd love to hear from you, your perspective on what type of griever you think that you are. How do you process grief?
Honestly, I'm not sure how to categorize how I deal with grief. It really depends on who it is that I've lost. Because like recently I've lost friends. And with my friends, I shut down for a day or so and, you know, think about them and, you know, remember all these things. But when I lost my mother and when I lost my mother-in-law, I shut it out because there were things that I had to get done. I had to arrange funerals. So I just, you know, sort of shut down the grief, took care of everything that I had to do. And then later on, it sort of hit me little by little. So I don't know how I would categorize myself. And I mean, something that I've been remembering as we're talking, the first time I really dealt with grief I was 11 when my father passed away. And the one thing that I remember that day almost in total, still, you know, all the, you know, over 40 years later, I still remember the details of that day. But one of the things that I remember being very hard on me was I grew up in New York City and the city was going through a drought. So there were all of these signs about saving water and what you could do to save water. And I remember in my classroom, right at the front, there was a sign that said, turn the water off when your father is shaving. And I had to face that sign every day. And I remember how that would get to me.
Understandably.
You know, so
Absolutely.
it's really very circumstantial for me. I mean, today I'll be triggered when I'm on Facebook and Facebook will remind me of somebody's birthday who is no longer with us. Or I'm inviting folks to an event and Facebook makes its recommendations who to invite and it recommends people who are no longer with us. And those sort of things still get to me. But I think a lot of it has to do with age and maturity. I mean, when my father passed away, I had no idea how to cope. Yeah. Now, you know, all these years later, it's sort of become, yeah, okay, I need to adjust to this, but let's just feel what I'm feeling and see where it takes me.
Absolutely. Jan, how about you? Anything you'd like to share or add about your thoughts on what type of griever you are or how you experience grief?
I know that I experience grief in my body. That is one way I experience it. It's also a way for me to process it. And I say that because I think that we do hold emotions in our body. And sometimes when we can't articulate them, we can feel that. Like for me, being a yoga teacher, I can almost move through them, and it gets me to a point where I can articulate it. Like I'll feel things, and I don't necessarily like to, because I think we tend to I'm a scientist by training, so I tend to label and categorize everything. And so I think sometimes with emotions, you can't do that, especially when they're so raw, and especially with something as complex as grief, because you're feeling so many different things at the same time, that I could feel it in my body and begin to process it and try to move it through. And then it would get to the point where it would almost soften, and it would get to the point where I could share it with someone else, or not, like based on what I wanted, but I could then articulate it. So I always think that that's probably one of the surest ways that I go through grief, is like, I'll be like, okay, where does this live in my body? And what can I do to kind of move it through? And that's always worked for me. I agree with everybody else in the fact that I think it depends on the person that I've lost. It also depends on how involved I was in their decline, like when they were declining. So for my example, my father, I was very involved in his caregiving. So I think I started grieving him long before he actually transitioned, because in my mind, he had been dying for a long period of time. And so when the actual event happened, I don't know that it was, I don't want to say it was easy, but I don't know that I would have had, it would have, like, it was hard, but I think it could have almost been a lot worse. It was kind of like I was ready, because he had been so ill that I was almost thankful that he was not in physical form anymore, because, which has its own guilt, because you kind of feel like kind of guilty for thinking that, but it was almost like this feeling of like, he wasn't really existing. Like he wasn't himself anymore, or the person that I had like loved and remembered. And that's the way I wanted to remember him. Like I didn't want to remember the end. So it was almost like I wanted him to transition so I could go back to the point where those fond memories that I had of him.
Which is hard, like you said, in its own way, and it's tangled up in its own, there's secondary types of grief. We have that anticipatory grief before something happens to someone and we know, and then we have the grief of the actual finality of it. And then we have the complex grief afterwards, the person they no longer were, the person they can no longer be, the relief that they're gone, and then that guilt associated with it because we feel like we should be sad and society puts that pressure on us to be sad. And then we're managing other people's symptomatic grief and reactions to us. So it's all incredibly very convoluted. And I think you touched on something really important too, is that being able to identify those feelings very quickly. It goes back to what Bill was saying earlier, that ambiguity, that it's so big, we're unable to identify it and articulate it. But we as a culture are very quick to want to assign a title and then fix it. And if we can't describe it, then we don't talk about it, because then we don't have to fix it. So these types of dialogues and conversations are so incredibly important around giving other people that verbiage to help. It's okay to not be able to articulate it. It's okay to not have a name or a label for how it feels, what it feels, where it feels. Eric saying that he's not sure how to categorize himself. It's not even necessarily being put into a box, but it's understanding. Like when I grieve, me personally, I've become very recluse, and it lives in my physical body, and it's almost like having a hangover. I am just toast for 2 days after a grief wave, where I am headachy and body ache and kind of angry and short fused and not really a good appetite, and my stomach's upset, and it really is like a terrible hangover. And I'm too old for that at my age now. It doesn't end well. So to think of it in a grief perspective, it's really in my physical body, and it took me a long time to untangle that connection between the emotional and the physical reaction. So I love that you have that verbiage that we're sharing with everyone. I want to ask you guys to think a little bit about your experiences with grief in relation to where you were in your life as you first started to experience them. And I know we've touched on this a little bit, But me growing up, I grew up strict Catholic, and I had been going to funerals since, before I could walk. Going to a funeral is like going to a family barbecue for me. And I hate to be so cavalier about that, but you just go to the funerals very young, you bring your children. So I've been exposed to death and dying and funerals and grief for a very long time. And I think had I not been exposed to that when I had my own personal experiences with grief, that may have been much harder on me. How do you think your early experiences or lack of early experiences with grief shaped how you grieve now as an adult?
Wow, that's like 32 questions right there.
I'm sorry.
So I didn't have a relationship to the word grief until I got into my late teens. Just wasn't, it was, the word was something that I may have heard other people talking about, like the grieving process, like there is one, like there's a step process you can actually go through here and you're back in control again.
Like an AA program almost.
100%, 12-step way to get out of unbelievable loss that is so devastating that you feel like you have a hangover for 2 days and are not able to function, would rather sit in the dark and cry. So the relationship to the words is something I think that came to me through expanding language by experiencing conversations with other people about someone who had passed. So that there were these kind of like ways to mix it up by putting other verbal ingredients into the stew, if you will. Like I remember this time, when the first time I rode a horse and my uncle said, when you get on the horse, you're going to have to listen to what it's not telling you, because that's going to be more important than what you think it is telling you. No idea what that meant. And I think the word grief for me was a lot like that too. Like when my mom was grieving Kennedy on the floor, she never talked about grief. My grandmother didn't talk about grief when my grandfather died. For them, it was, my life is over. I've got nothing to live for anymore. There's no meaning for me after this, And those kinds of things, especially to a kid, and the parents and adults are not really thinking about what it sounds like. And so you asked another part of the question, which is how did that kind of inform how I grieve now? I think what I really got to understand was my grieving process did not get many upgrades between the time I was 6 and 65. As someone said, it wasn't necessarily that grief showed up the same way all the time. Most times it didn't. And it wasn't even something that I sat down and said, I feel this way because of that. It was just like, sometimes it was really horrible to hear about a dear friend who was 83 years old that I had just left a networking meeting with. And we were talking about doing something together over the coming weeks, an event we were going to do. And then to find out that he had died over the weekend, and that's why he didn't call me back while I was calling him names, unreliable and all. So when it gets to the point where, and those of you at home at a certain age, you will not be able to insulate yourself from your frequent flyers, the people that you have gotten together with socially and or other ways. If you live in a retirement community down in Florida, it's just going to be the coin of the realm that people are here one day and the next day they're not. And I think, Eric, you said something like, I want to be president. I want to feel this. I want to see what it actually feels like. I think you said the latter and not the former. But for me, it was kind of the same thing. Since I don't have words for this and I don't really have an effective label, and it's not the same thing all the time, why don't I just act like I've gone into a room where I don't know anything that's in it and look around and just see what's there? And that was comforting to me in a way. There wasn't a judgmental part of it that I should be able to deal with this better than I am. As a matter of fact, there were no shoulds at all. It was a lot more like, where does it hurt? You know, doing a body scan and a mental inventory of what part of my body is really in pain right at this moment, and less about why is it in pain and a lot more about identifying what it is and being present to it. And I grew up a lot between the age of 65, and that's about the time that my mom passed away, and last year when my dad passed away. What I knew was we were on a declining slope here. We would get less quality time together. And it was huge for me to be around and just be a support. And the thing that I enjoyed the most about it was being with my dad, who was a high-level, C-level defense contracting vice president with up to 48,000 people reporting to him, who was now reduced to this guy who was blind, could barely get around, and was telling me stories about this girl that he dated when he was in high school. And it was a thrill, you know, for him to just open up to me and say she had big boobs, okay? This is an 88-year-old man reminiscing about his first love, and he's been married 3 times to my mother and then 2 other really wonderful women after. But the point is that sometimes there's some, you can't understand the understandable, in my opinion. The understandable is a red herring for wasting your time and your emotion, trying to focus in on disappearing something that has no cause. It's just there. You know, and I refer to it kind of like in a similar vein to Archie Bunker when Edith was going through menopause. And he said, "You're driving me nuts over here with that, okay? I'm going to give you a minute now. Go ahead and change." Well, somehow it didn't work.
Quite poignant, very much so.
Yeah, I mean, the frustration with wanting things to be different than they are, isn't that kind of the human condition? As opposed to really like getting into the soup of how are they? What is going on here?
I think with grief, there comes a certain lack of curiosity, both as a griever and a grievee, someone supporting someone who's grieving, where we are so quick as a culture, like we've said previously, to fix it or to feel better or to get them back to normal, that we don't have that curiosity about why they're acting this way, whether it's grief or not. And we don't know where people are. You never know where someone is. You know, the barista at the coffee shop didn't get your order right and was kind of crabby, and you just automatically assume they're a jerk. Well, for all you know, their dog died this morning. It really can be so integral into how we have those interpersonal communications and interactions with grief. And we as a global community post-COVID are experiencing grief in a way that the world has never experienced it before. So even more so now, it's important that we get curious and get empathetic and get introspective and start to think about grief in a broader spectrum. Anybody else have any feedback before we move on?
Yeah, this now that we're getting into this, I'm thinking back, even though I've just lost my parents over the last couple of years, and both of them were pretty quick. I mean, I didn't have to go through any long things. But my first experience with death, I will never forget. I'm the oldest of 7, and I was in 7th grade, and it was the day we're going back to school after New Year's. And my brother Phil, who was a year younger than me, I think I was probably 12, 13 years old. He said, Mr. Redden, who was our next door neighbor and the father of 8, died last night. And I thought he was kidding me. I thought he was kidding me. And he sure enough had a heart attack. He woke up in the middle of the night, 40 years old, and was gone. And that was my first experience of death. His daughter was a classmate of mine. I never really knew her that well, but that was my first experience. Couple that with the fact that when I was 9 years old, moving into 4th grade, Bill, you got me by 3 months, by the way.
We'll cheer me and then we'll cheer you, okay?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a large family still in Wisconsin, but since age 9, everything was out here. So the first time I lost a grandparent, I was in college, but I really never knew my grandmother that well because she was never out here. Lost other people that way. I think the one that hit me the hardest was my godfather, my Uncle Paul, who was the youngest in my mom's family, who was never sick a day in his life, and then all of a sudden got pancreatic cancer and was gone right before he turned 60. And he was a teacher at a school, and his funeral was like unbelievable. And that really hit me. But again, looking at my parents, me being the oldest of 7 and my youngest sister is just 10 and a half years behind me, I was always a loner. I mean, back in the 60s, and you know this, Bill, they'd open the door in the morning, we'd go outside and play, and they'd blow the whistle at night. We'd come home after drinking out of the hose all day and eat dinner. And that's just, and so there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis put on things. I mean, my wife, when her parents passed away, they both spent some time in the nursing home before they left us, but they both lived into their 80s also. So it's, it's a different thing for everybody. But with me, I mean, I really haven't been that close with that. As I said, I have not lost a sibling. I've lost cousins out in Wisconsin, who I really hardly ever knew. I've lost some friends and so on and so forth. And obviously losing my parents, it's, and looking at my own mortality. But again, I think I have things really in perspective as far as the way that I look at all of that. And fortunately, I have not been really exposed to the shocker of, that obviously a lot of you folks have been. So,
I'll share. So 2 things. I think my first experience of death was actually the loss of a pet. And in that way, I'm a pet person, as Eric mentioned, my podcast is Pets, People, Life and Longevity, all about life with a pet. And so that was probably my first experience, but also probably my greatest experience in having like something that I considered such a close friend, my cat, that had passed away. And I thought it would, in a lot of ways, especially as I moved into adulthood and had friends who had never experienced death before, losing anybody before they were in their 20s or older, I always thought, it was a great thing to go through, to realize that everything is, every life is precious and every life is fragile, and so in that way, I think the most impactful death was a family member who committed suicide when I was in high school. And my father was an only child, and he was, a cousin of my father who was more like a brother to my father. And I think that was because I remember him per se, that the effect that it had on my father. And so I think that was probably one of the hardest losses, with someone who had taken their own life and, who had been in that much pain to actually not see any solution at all.
Yeah, that had to have been incredibly difficult, because in that instance, you're already wrapped up in ambiguity and the unknown. And then to take that component of the struggle that you can't even begin to wrap your head around that they were going through, it just compounds that feeling of hopelessness. And so I'm so sorry for that. Well, I want to thank you all. I know we're almost out of time. I think we've got a few minutes left, but I want to give it back to Eric and make sure that we wrap up anything we need to. But I really just want to thank you all for your participation, for your transparency, for your contribution to the global conversation around grief, and helping me to change the landscape and create compassion in the world. So thank you, Eric, for this incredible opportunity to facilitate this conversation. If anyone out there would like more information or resources in terms of grief education and coaching, you can find me at my website. On Tuesdays, we wear black. That's my business name, www.otwwb.com, where I do blog, I do interpersonal conversations, as well as business coaching for any organization out there needing support with their workers or their customers. And with that, Eric, I'll kick it back over to you to tie things up.
All right. Well, thank you so much for facilitating this, Kate. And thanks to all of our participants for being so open and willing to participate in what is a really difficult conversation. I hope our listeners have benefited from this. And you can hear this as part of Lighting the Candle, as well as the Success Showcase. And we will see you all in our next episodes. So thanks for listening.
For more on this topic, tune in to part 2 on the Success Showcase. You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch every episode as well as the rest of the network at exvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.